are Lord of all.
Hey everyone, welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. Back at my house doing it for you and glad to be with you. For those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time, my name is Tim Wright. I'm one of the pastors at Community of Grace Lutheran Church in Peoria. And every Wednesday night we do a brief Bible study looking back at the sermon story that we used in the weekend worship and dig a bit deeper into it. So our story last weekend during worship was the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Now, Mark says there were 5,000 men there, but when you add in women and children, maybe a few cats and dogs and some horses, you've got yourself about 10 to 15,000 people. And what we're looking at today will take us a little deeper into the story itself, but what we looked at basically at the weekend was this audacious invitation that Jesus had for his disciples. They are standing in front of 15,000 people. These people are hungry, and Jesus says to them, "You feed them. You give them something to eat." Now, these 12 guys had to have been stunned, just as we are when we look at the numbers for hunger in our world. And we talked about some of those on the weekend, how over 800 million people go to bed at night with little to no food. And Jesus says to us, "You feed them. You give them something to eat." And we're stunned by that request. We're surprised by it. We're a bit angered by it because it seems impossible, until Jesus comes along and says, "Well, let's start with this. What do you have?" And the disciples had just a few loaves of bread, a couple pieces of fish, and Jesus used that to feed 15,000 people. And he can use what little we have, or even the lot that we have, and make a difference with that. So that's what we focused on in the sermon. What I want to do today is take us a little bit deeper into the story itself, some of the things that are going on there. And I want to start by looking with you very quickly at the word parable. We know that Jesus' primary way of teaching us about the kingdom of God was through the telling of stories that we call parables. And he used a lot of different storytelling techniques to teach us about the kingdom of God, to teach us about God. He would use illustrations, he would use comparisons, he would use similes, he would use metaphors. The kingdom of God is like, and then he would go off and tell a story. And so Jesus was a parable-telling theologian. In other words, the way that Jesus did theology, the way that Jesus talked about God was through story. Now, his miracles were another way of talking about God. And there are some of these miracle stories that scholars call parabolic actions, that they not only serve as miracles, but they have a storytelling quality to them in the miracle itself. And so you see Jesus sort of performing, in a sense, a story that gives us an insight into God. And this is one of those stories, the feeding of the 5,000. It is such an important story that it's the only miracle story in all four of the Gospels. It was that important to the early Christians and, of course, important to us. So we're going to look at this story a bit. It's from Mark chapter 6, starting at verse 30. Let me get my glasses on here so I can see. And Mark starts the story this way. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. They had been out on a little speaking tours themselves. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now, Mark's writing style is always moving. You get one story, and then he says, immediately Jesus did this. Then immediately Jesus did that. And we've seen this in Mark already. So just in the last chapter or two, Jesus has been in a boat that was in a storm, and he calms the storm, and then he takes on a legion of demons, 6,000 demons in a man. He comes to the other side of the lake. He sends his disciples out to do some preaching and teaching. They come back. They're surrounded constantly by people. They haven't even had a chance to eat yet. So they're exhausted. And that's why Jesus said, "Hey, let's get away and rest a while." But that rest is short-lived. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. Now, just to get a sense of this, the Sea of Galilee is a big, big lake, and a lot of Jesus' ministry takes place at the northern end of it. So he may go in a boat ride from here to here. The people just run around the shore and they get there before Jesus does. So they can see the boat crossing. You can't miss it. And they're running around to get ahead of him. So even though they try to get away, the people get there before Jesus does. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now, that's a great line. I was reading one pastor who picked up on this, and I thought it was a great insight. He said, Jesus sees this crowd of people. They're like a sheep without a shepherd. And the first thing that he does isn't perform miracles. He teaches them. He fills their souls. He can tell that they're hungry for something of substance, something sacred. And so he teaches them, and he fills their souls with the things of God. It says that he was moved with compassion for them. Now, Mark can use a couple different words for that. We've seen in the past when Jesus encountered the leper that Jesus had compassion, which meant he was angry. He was angry not at the leper, but at the disease and at what leprosy had done to the man. In this case, it's a bit more nuanced. He has compassion. He's not angry this time. It's more that word, that Greek word for sympathy. He's deeply moved in the depths of his being for them. He has this sense of mercy, and he wants to share that mercy with them because he could see that they were hungry for the things of God. So Jesus is exhausted. Jesus is hungry. He hasn't eaten for a while, and he teaches. He says, these people are important. I'll put my own needs aside, and I'll speak to them. So when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat. Now, food in Jesus' day was a daily concern for many of the people who followed him. We've talked before at church how many of these people lived from day to day. Many of the workers were day laborers. And if they didn't get a job that day, it could ruin them financially. And so food was really important for those people, as it is for us. But we can go to a grocery store. We can go to QT. We can go to McDonald's. They didn't have that luxury. So food, I don't want to say necessarily was scarce. It was just not as easy to come by as it is for us. And so for them to spend an entire day without food, knowing that food is precious to them and they need to get their food, the disciples go to Jesus. And they're speaking out of concern and compassion. They're saying, hey, it's, Jesus, you've been speaking now for about 8-9 hours. These people need to get home and they need to eat. And they're just being wise. They're being smart. They're being compassionate. They want to send the people home so that they can eat. And that's when Jesus surprises them. He said, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, are you crazy? They didn't say that, but they're thinking it. They said to him, are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? Now, 200 denarii is about a year's salary. These disciples don't have that kind of money. So imagine the shock. And we tried to pick up on that a little bit this past weekend. Imagine the shock. 12 guys, 15,000 people. And Jesus is saying, you feed them. And they know that he's not kidding because Jesus doesn't joke around like that when it comes to the things of God. So they know that he's probably saying something significant here, but they can't get their brains around it. Just like we can't get our brains around 800 million people going to bed tonight without food and thinking we're supposed to feed them. How do we do that? In my imagination, I see Jesus asking this with a bit of a mischievous grin because he knows what he's going to do. He knows he's shocking the disciples, but he's already ready to do something great through them. And I wonder if Jesus is even anticipating the sheer joy the disciples are going to have in these next few moments. And if you've ever given to somebody and helped somebody, maybe even if it's on the street corner and you give them $5, and just this sense of I think I've done something significant. I think I participated in something of God. These disciples are getting ready to do that 15,000 times. So I think Jesus does this with a sense of humor. And he's not just saying, well, you feed them. He's just sort of, hey, well, why don't you guys feed them? And so I think there's a little bit of mischief in Jesus at this point. So he says to them, how many loaves have you? Go and see. So Jesus breaks into their shock, as we talked about this last weekend, with grace. And he said, well, let's start with what you have. And let's see where we go from there. When they had found out, they said 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, again, that's a very small meal. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit on in groups on the green grass. By the way, that's why we think this happened in the springtime, because the grass is green. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and hundreds. Let me say that again. They sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. All right, they didn't have to social distance back then. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. The better translation is all ate and were satisfied. Love that. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. So again, add in women and children, 10 to 15,000 people fed. Just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So again, I kind of think the disciples, are really hesitant. They bring out this bread. They've got 2 smelly fish. And Jesus said, okay, have people sit down. So they do that. And then Jesus starts handing out bread, starts handing out fish, and the disciples take it to those in the front row, and they come back, and there's more, and there's more, and there's more. You got to imagine the disciples, by the time they had fed 15,000 people, were absolutely giddy to be a part of something so massive, so outlandish, so indescribable. And Jesus had invited them into that moment. And that's the moment he invites us into as well. Now, the question often asked of this story is, how did that miracle happen? And there are different interpretations of that. There are the one interpretation that most of us have grown up with is that Jesus just kept breaking the bread off, and it never ran out. He kept breaking those fish, however you break fish, and pieces of fish never ran out. It just kept happening over and over and over again. A second interpretation is that when people realized that they were sitting down to eat and there's no food, and this little meal was brought out, that other people brought their meals out that they had brought, some, and began to share their food with the people in their groups. And so while it wasn't a physical miracle that took place in this interpretation, with Jesus just taking that same bread over and over again, there was a spiritual miracle that took place in the people's lives, where they took food out, which again is scarce. They probably packed just enough for themselves, those who packed it, and then they shared it with everybody else. And what they discovered was that in giving, in generosity, there was more than enough. I think either one's miraculous. Whether Jesus did it physically and just took the same bread and multiplied it over and over again, or if it was the generosity of the people that fed hungry people, I think they're both fantastic because both took Jesus. He moved those people to generosity in some way, shape, or form. And of course, that leaves us with the big question, how will we respond to that invitation to feed God's hungry people? So what does this story say about Jesus? If this is a parable in action, an acted out parable, what does it say about Jesus? What does it say about God? First thing I think that the people sitting out in that audience that first day would have thought was, hey, this is the new Moses. Remember now, when Moses led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, he was a teacher and lawgiver, so he taught them, and he also fed them manna from heaven. It just came miraculously. They never knew where it came from. In fact, the word manna means, what is it? They didn't even know what it was, so they just called it, what is it? What are you having for breakfast today? What is it? Yeah, but what are you having for breakfast? What is it? That's what I'm asking you. What are you having for... All right, you get the point. So Jesus here is seen as, and in a sense, he's setting himself up as the new Moses, the new liberator, the one who's going to lead his people out of exile to sin and death and despair and injustice and inequality into the full, rich life of the kingdom of God. So the people sitting out in the grass that day would have seen their new Moses coming. We also see that Jesus is a Messiah who cares about the physical needs of people. Far too often in especially more evangelical Christian circles, it's always about the soul. How is your soul? Are we saving souls? Are we leading people to Jesus? Jesus' ministry was certainly about reconnecting people with God, but it was also about those very tangible things: feeding people, fighting for justice, breaking down social barriers and ethnic barriers. Jesus was all about that, and you see it over and over again in the stories he tells and in his actions, and this is one of them, where Jesus shows that God's heart isn't just about saving souls, it's about feeding hungry people, and that he cares about us mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and relationally. And so Jesus shows a commitment to the poor, so that means that he stands in a long line of the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, who over and over and over again, on behalf of God, said, look, your worship is fine, but real worship is to feed the hungry, to care for the widow, to watch out for the orphans. That's what worship looks like, and Jesus stands in that line. Another important concept for the people of Israel was that someday, when the Messiah came, there'd be a big banquet. That was the metaphor for the Messiah coming, this huge banquet where all the peoples are gathered together, and there's a lavish feast like they'd never seen before as they live under God's rule. And so by serving this banquet, Jesus is giving the sense to them that he's the Messiah. He's the one who's bringing the messianic banquet to reality. And then finally, Jesus is showing us, and John's gospel picks up on this, that Jesus is the bread of life. He's the sustenance of life, the one who nurtures life in us. There are some really interesting parallels in this story to communion. So let me just read for you again what happens and see if you recognize some of the language from when we do the story of communion together. He took the 5 loaves, he looked up into heaven, he blessed it, he broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples. It's much of the same language. He took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, gave it to his disciples. So it's the same kind of language used in communion, which means that every time we get together for communion, we are re-experiencing the presence of Jesus and the feeding of the 5,000. And he feeds us that we might feed his world. All right, that's a little bit more on the feeding of the 5,000. And this weekend, as we get back together for worship, we've got another story from the Gospel of Mark. And this is one of my favorites. They're all my favorites. This is where Jesus walks on water. And he starts coming toward the disciples. And what we're going to talk about this weekend is, in this storm called COVID, what are the things we see coming toward us? And how might we see Jesus? So I hope you'll join us for that. If you'd like to join us in the building, we are now open. Saturday night at 5 o'clock and Sunday at 9 o'clock. You can go to boldrecklessgrace.org, boldrecklessgrace.org/reopening, and you can RSVP. We make sure that we keep just enough seats available to keep us socially distanced. So you can go to boldrecklessgrace.org/reopening to RSVP. We'd love to have you there. It's been great having people in the building, but if you can't join us, our services will be live streamed on Facebook and I believe this week on YouTube at the same time. And more information, boldrecklessgrace.org. Thursday night, tomorrow night, Tony and Lisa will be doing some music. Friday night, Pastor Kathleen at 6 o'clock, along with her family, doing Faith 5, and then, of course, our weekend worship. I hope you've enjoyed our Bible study. If you did, please share it with your friends, and we look forward to seeing you in the days and weeks to come. God's best to you.